for today's Zen pointers, I would like to take a case that is in our set of koans, exchanges between Zen masters and monks or other Zen masters that somehow are pointers to that which our hearts are longing for as we engage in this practice. What is it that we are really seeking as we continue in this way of sustained practice of stillness? Let us see what these Zen masters have to say. This is from the 24th case of what is known as the Book of Equanimity, or in Japanese, it's called Shoyo Roku. And so I will just read the case, outlining, or rather describing the exchange between Zen Master Seppo and then Gensha and Unmon, three Zen masters. Seppo, instructing the assembly, said, "There's a turtle-nosed snake on the South Mountain. All of you should look at it carefully." Chokei said, "Today in the Zen hall, there are many people who have lost their body and life." A monk told this to Gensha, who said, "Only my elder brother Ryo," referring to Chokei, "could say something like that. However, I wouldn't talk like that," said Gensha. The monk asked, "What then would you say, master?" Gensha replied, "Why does it have to be the South Mountain?" Hearing this, Unmon threw his staff in front of Seppo and acted frightened. Here are Zen adepts having a little Zen banter, you could say. They are doing all of this, saying all of these things, if you're hearing correctly, with tongue-in-cheek. So know that the words that are used in Zen are really just pointers to that which in our practice we are earnestly longing and aspiring to encounter and behold and be transformed by. So what are these Zen masters talking about? They're talking about a turtle-nosed snake that can be deadly. It is a poisonous snake. And so that must be the shape of one of those poisonous snakes that they knew in China. So they're using that metaphor to describe something in Zen. On the South Mountain, there's a turtle-nosed snake, says Seppo. What is that South Mountain? Well, the background of this is that Zen at that point was flourishing in two lineages. One was the so-called Southern School of Zen, and then there was also a Northern School of Zen, and they somehow seem to have a kind of a spirit of rivalry among one another as to who could really have more enlightened people and so on, how many more monks they could have in their monasteries practicing with them and so on. So there was that kind of spirit of competition between the South School and the Northern School. And so there were other schools that had arisen in Zen. And then, of course, when it came to Korea and Japan, they had their own styles that were adapted in their new countries, and then some new schools developed. So that's how Zen goes. As people get what the point of Zen is, then they begin to also share that with others, and they develop a style and way of practice that somehow they found effective. And so with that, whether that becomes something that hits the chord of many people who are seeking meaning or seeking the matter of great importance in their lives or not, is the factor that determines whether a certain school or style flourishes or not. In any case, here Seppo says in the South Mountain, namely referring to the Southern School of Zen, there's a turtle-nosed snake. There's a deadly snake, so watch out for it. What's he saying here? Well, just to make it plain, in our Southern school where we practice earnestly, people can really lose their little egoic selves and die to that self and realize the infinite. They can realize infinite life and infinite love and infinite light. Those are some words that I'm taking at liberty to point out what this is all about. When you die to your little self that is full of conflicts and full of questions and full of struggles in this life, and when you allow that self to really open up to the infinite light and infinite love that is there waiting for us to realize, then that little self is no more, and we are simply vehicles of that infinite love and light that I have said in my previous talks. So watch out as you continue practicing in this way. So Seppo was referring to the Southern School. We have an effective way that we have developed in our school that helps people die to their little egoic selves and realize that infinite horizon of emptiness, of light and love, and all of those big words that you can use for it. So then, he then invites practitioners, watch out, so practice earnestly so that you may be able to attain that newness of life. So all of you should look at it carefully. That's what he says. And so Chokei, in a very down-to-earth manner, says today, even today, in the very Zen hall where people are sitting, that snake has already taken so many lives, meaning there are so many earnest people in their practice, even in our Zen hall now, that they have already given up their small selves, their egoic selves, and have seen that infinite light and infinite life already. So that's the way these little sentences are to be taken. But when you say it in that way, it becomes rather prosaic, and so they're using these images of snake and losing lives and so on. So a monk then asked another Zen master, Gensha, who asked him about it. What do you think about this exchange, about the snake in the South Mountain, and that there are people who have lost their lives? By the way, when we say Zendo, they're referring to a physical Zendo, but now since we don't have a physical Zendo, we consider this circle of people engaged in practice as our virtual Zendo, of course, and as our extended Zendo. So the space that you take to sit in your respective places, wherever you are, in Dallas, in California, in Irving, in Arlington, or in Florida, Oklahoma, and so on, the specific locations that you are part of that extended Zendo that we are taking as our place of practice together. And in that Zendo, watch out, lives are being taken. So said in an ironic kind of way. So that is my wish for all of you, that you are able to be bitten by that snake and that your lives are now opened up to that infinite and unfathomable and immeasurable light and love. So with that in the background, Gensha said, well, only Chokei could say it like that. Then the monk asked, well, that's because Chokei is like that. He's referring to the assiduous practice in the Zendo. That's fine with him. But for me, I would say it in a different way. And the monk asked him, how would you say it? This is what I'd like to pay attention to. Why does it have to be the South Mountain? Why do you have to localize it and say it's only there where that snake is available? It's all over the place. And so Unmon, hearing this, threw his staff in front of Seppo and acted frightened, as if the snake were in front of him. So he made this kind of dramatic act of being in front of the snake and being about to be killed by that snake. Those are Zen masters acting like clowns, or speaking like comedians, or speaking in these allusions. But what they're pointing to us is this practice of ours exposes us to that snake that may then kill our little egoic self and open it up to a new life. So watch out, in a good sense. Watch out, in other words, pay attention. But it doesn't have to be just in the Zendo, or it doesn't just have to be Zen. There are many different ways in which that snake that kills the ego can bite us and open us up to that new life, that infinite life and love that our hearts are longing for. That reminds me of a poem by Mary Oliver, who wrote, "It doesn't have to be the blue iris." So she's talking about the poetic inspiration here, where some poet sees a very beautiful flower and then gets inspirations, or a beautiful sunset, and then is inspired by that and writes a poem that lasts and is treasured in human heritage and so on. But she says, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot, or a few small stones. Just pay attention. And then she says, as a poet, for those who are listening about what poetry is all about, and then just pay attention and then patch a few words together. Don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. So let's take those words of Mary Oliver and lifting them out of the context of writing poetry, but simply in terms of our own way of practicing Zen. What can we learn from what Mary Oliver says? In previous talks, I've taken Mary Oliver as a pointer to help us see where we are heading in our Zen practice. But for this one, I'm repeating what I had said earlier, but not what she says here is abbreviating that part about writing poetry, but applying it to our practice of allowing ourselves to die to the little egoic self and open our lives to the infinite. She says, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It doesn't have to be anything special, like doing what you're doing now in Zen, sitting in attention, or practicing with Mu and so on. It could be simply noticing weeds in a vacant lot, or a few small stones. Just pay attention. And that's the point, really. The point of our sitting here, breathing in and breathing out, and allowing our mind to settle in the here and now, is to precisely remove those obstacles that prevent us from entering that doorway to the infinite. And so what is that doorway? This is not a contest. So don't think that you're trying to compete with yourself or with anybody else, or with those others who are more enlightened than you think, and so on. It's not a contest. It's simply an invitation to open your heart. This is not a contest, but a doorway into thanks. I like that. What happens when your heart is opened, when that little egoic self dies to itself and opens up to that infinite, is the profusion of gratitude from your heart. The only thing to say really is thanks. Thank you. I'm so glad I was born to see this reality. This is why I was born, to really realize this and encounter that which is beyond words. And that is within reach of each and every one of us, even without practicing Zen. But with this practice of Zen, we have a very, very helpful and effective way of removing the obstacles to that doorway to thanks, to that profusion of gratitude that wells up in our hearts when we realize that boundless and that infinite source of light and love. It's a doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. What can that be? So what we're cultivating here is silence, the silence wherein another voice may speak. What is that another voice that Mary Oliver is talking about? If we recall some of her own poems and some of her own writings in the prose, she gives an account of her own journey of amazement. That is a key word of Mary Oliver. What is this life all about? It's all about being amazed at the grasses and trees and the pebbles and the weeds in the garden and the sky and the clouds. Each and everything around us is a cause for amazement. And the fact that we exist here, breathing in and breathing out, we tend to take it for granted. We wake up in the morning, oh, okay, another day, wash your face, go to breakfast, do your thing, and so on. And unfortunately, miss the whole point, the amazement of it all, the wonder of it all, the fact that I'm here breathing in and breathing out, the fact that as I look outside, I see pebbles, I see grass, I see little trees, I see houses, I see people walking their dogs. What an amazing thing it is. And yet we say, oh, it's so ordinary. That happens all the time. Yes, it happens all the time, but we miss it in that way of just comparing it with what has happened and therefore just lining it up with those things that we think we know already. But when we realize it need not be, all of these things don't have to be, and yet they are. That might be a ground of amazement. The fact that I'm here breathing in and breathing out is my gateway to that amazement, which opens me up to that reality of the holy that permeates throughout everything and everyone in this universe. So Martin Heidegger had a book that I read when I was an undergraduate with the title, Why Do Things Exist Rather Than Nothing? Or why are there beings rather than nothing? That was a book called Introduction to Metaphysics. And that somehow, that first line of that book somehow already struck me. Yeah, he's right. Why are there things rather than nothing? Even asking that question already brings us to a sense of, yeah, that's right, and makes us be amazed and not take anything for granted. The fact that I can project my voice and convey some things that have meaning that you can also understand and hopefully sense the kind of meanings that I'm pointing out, or the fact that I can raise my right hand or my left hand when I want, or I can wiggle my body like this and so on. These very simple things, just try them yourselves. Isn't that amazing that you can do that? So, okay, good. And so many other things. Each moment in life, a cause for amazement. So this amazement, therefore, is something that points us to a direction of going to the source of that amazement so that we will always be in the light of that wonder and amazement throughout our lives. So our way of sitting, breathing in and breathing out, and just allowing ourselves to come back to the stillness is our way of shaking off the dust of so-called ordinariness that says, oh yeah, the same old thing all over again, the same old, and so on. and realize that each thing, each moment is really a gift from that infinite horizon. What is that infinite horizon all about? Precisely, it's something beyond words, but it's an invitation for all of us to open our eyes, the eyes of our heart, the ears of our heart, the sensations of our heart, to see that it's all over the place. Our little ego can be taken up and be absorbed in that by anything around us. It doesn't have to be anything beautiful like a sunset or a blue iris or a very deep samadhi experience in Zen and so on. But it could simply be just looking around and walking and seeing something like a tree or a pebble or even a fly buzzing around, and finding that as the gateway. But what does this Zen practice do to us? Then, okay, if I say that, okay, then we don't have to do all of this rigmarole of sitting like this in an intensive way, going through all this effort. What does this practice do? It allows our mind to be able to open up and, as Mary Oliver says, pay attention. So let me just give a more intricate description of what happens if you are sitting in the way that this Zen tradition invites you to sit. Namely, as we take a posture conducive to stillness, we breathe in and we breathe out, and then our mind settles into the here and now with every breath. So as we do so, the gap between our subjective consciousness, the one that always makes me at the center of the world and everything else outside is something separate from me, that kind of ordinary consciousness that we take for granted, that way of thinking, that way of being, that way of allowing ourselves to presume that that's reality, becomes something that fades little by little. And so the subjective consciousness fades, the objective world fades, and what we are able to zero in on is simply that stillness, whereby it's just this breath. And with each breath, even the breath is no longer something that we need to be too focused on, but simply allowing the breath to take place and allowing our mind to settle into that breath. And we enter more and more deeply into the silence. And in the midst of that silence, one little stimulus could be a sound, like the sound of the bell, or the sound of somebody sneezing, or the sound of a dog barking in the distance. Or it could be a color or a sight that we see in front of us. It could be a patch on the wall that I am facing when I sit, or if I'm facing a window outside with grass and trees and so on, it could be just one patch of that lawn with the grass. Or it could be a sensation of cold. For example, the air conditioner is a little strong, and so it's that shiver that comes through my skin. Or it could be the rumblings of a hungry belly saying, oh, it's about time for lunch. But it's not so much that which leads to another thought, but that little rumbling, whether it's something we see or hear or taste or touch, can be just that, whereby there is no longer I am seeing this or I am hearing this, or there is that sound out there, but it is simply bong, or it is simply rumble, rumble. I'm using a word to describe a sound that is just something that may happen in our intestines and so on. All of these gateways through the senses can be the doorway to thanks that Mary Oliver is talking about, if we are in that state whereby subjective consciousness and the objective world have merged and have become just that, and that could be any one of these stimuli that I have mentioned, or whatever it is. It could also be a thought that comes into mind when I'm sitting like here and like right here, and the thought or the image in my mind is what catapults me into that world that is beyond subject and object. And as the little egoic self dies, the objective world also fades, and there is no longer anything that I can see from my subjective side, and there's no longer any object that is there to be seen or heard or touched, but it is simply that realm of just as it is. The Buddha described this enlightenment as seeing everything just as they are, seeing things just as they are. And what he is pointing out there is that to see everything just as it is to go beyond the subject object way of seeing, whereby I am conscious of myself seeing and there's something out there that I'm seeing as an object. But so that would be only a one-dimensional way of seeing. The way of seeing that the Buddha describes is a 360 dimensional way, a 360 degree dimensional way of seeing everything just as it is from all angles. How can we do that? We cannot do that as long as we remain as an individual subjective consciousness here. That's why that's when that subjective consciousness fades away, and in the midst of our practice somehow dissolves, then that world of the 360 degree angle comes up, and I see. What do I see? I see my true nature, and that's what the term Buddha nature is all about, the awakened nature of seeing everything just as it is. And there's a poem by the Japanese poet Basho that says, "From the bamboo, learn of the bamboo. From the pine tree, learn of the pine tree." There is no longer a subject looking at the pine tree or the bamboo, but the pine tree looks at itself. The bamboo looks at itself in all splendor. And where am I? From the bamboo, learn of the bamboo. When this eye has died, when it has been bitten by that snake, then that new life appears, that new light appears, and there we are ushered into the doorway to thanks. So let us continue our practice and go deeper into that stillness, so that that stillness will open us up to that place where we know each and every one of us is bathed in that light and affirmed in love. And the only thing we can do with that is to love back and to give thanks for each and everything that we taste in this life. Let's continue in our cultivation of that stillness that will open that doorway.